My name is Megan Hyska, and I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University. And this is a talk which aims to inquire into a theory of social organizing. Specifically, what we're setting out to do here is to identify what function we typically ask a notion of social organizing to do in our social and political discourse, and to see about constructing a concept that can fulfill these functions. Now, as a heads up, I don't think that any of the attempts that we look at today do a fully satisfactory job of giving us this theory, but I think that we'll still have done something worthwhile if we can A, motivate this line of inquiry, and B, come to appreciate a bit more about why giving a theory of social organizing will be difficult, and why, contrary to what we might have thought, a theory of social organizing doesn't actually just fall straightforwardly out of a theory of organized groups or of group agency. So why target social organizing when we're doing social philosophy? Well, because the concept of social organizing plays at least two important roles in our socio-political discourse. And to get at the first of these roles, I want to give a fairly contemporary example. So back in late 2020, kind of during the Trump-Biden interregnum, when progressive leftists in the United States are considering how they should advance their agenda, specifically their agenda concerning healthcare in the incoming Congress, one proposal, the hashtag Force the Vote proposal, is that what the Congressional Progressive Caucus ought to do is to force a floor vote on Medicare for All legislation by threatening to withhold votes supporting Nancy Pelosi's speakership until she promised to give them the vote. So here's Jimmy Dore, who's a progressive podcaster and YouTuber, talking about this proposal. He wasn't the only one. Cornel West went on his show saying, yeah, that's a great idea. Brianna Joy Gray, who was the National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, endorsed this idea. But there were also lots of progressives and leftists who were very critical of this as a tactic for winning Medicare for All. And what's going to be important for us is to observe the specific reasons that they give for criticizing this as a tactic. So David Sirota, who had been a senior analyst to Bernie Sanders, says, look, it's easier to do YouTube rants and get retweets about a high-profile floor vote. That's what he takes it that Jimmy Dore and Brianna Joy Gray were doing, than it is to get everyone excited about the much harder organizing work of getting esoteric HHS waivers or removing a relatively obscure committee chairman who is blocking progress. Ben Burgess, a philosopher, leftist writer, says, political theater can be a useful educational tool, but it can't be a substitute for the long, slow, and often dismally unsexy work of what? Organizing. The left's goals can only be one with organizing. And the national leadership of the Democratic Socialists of America put out a statement gently but firmly rejecting force the vote as a tactic for winning Medicare for All. And in the concluding paragraph where they summarize their position, they say, we are socialists and we are organizers, so we know that there are no shortcuts to liberation. So it looks like what critics of the force the vote tactic agree on is that forcing the vote at that moment would represent an attempt to do politics without organizing. Okay, so we're seeing that a notion of organizing, and clearly it's social organizing that they have in mind here, plays a key role in strategic deliberation and prescription around what strategies should be adopted by a given political movement. This happens all the time. I think the case is in Giving Her All on the left, but I don't think this is actually just a preserve of the left. So if you go back to Occupy, as Burns and Clover note here, the exhortation to organize has often been heard in the dissolution of the various Occupy encampments in the U.S., from left thinkers as various as Noam Chomsky, Doug Henwood, and Jody Dean. And if we go back further in time, we see Ella Baker, who is here critically discussing an inflection point in the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, where she discerns a kind of turn towards emphasizing charismatic and provocative leadership figures rather than the organizing of everyday people. She says, look, I keep bringing this up. I'm sorry, but it's part of me. I just don't see anything to be substituted for having people understand their position and understand their potential power and how to use it. This can only be done, as I see it, through the long route of actually organizing people in small groups and parlaying those into larger groups. Okay, so just to observe about those cases that I just gave is that when these speakers cite the absence of organizing in some derogated political strategy, they take it that they're offering a reason that that strategy is to be dispreferred. They're not just reiterating that they think it should be. So in short, the notion of social organizing plays a key role in this kind of reason-giving in the context of strategic deliberation. I'll briefly mention this other role that I think a notion of social organizing plays, and this I think is just extremely widespread, where we say something to the effect that X happened because such and such organizing made it happen. That is, we appeal to the notion of organizing to explain events that took place. So here's just a random example from the American Prospect, talking about the Warnock-Ossoff victory in Georgia. The organizing that brought Georgia to the brink was a shared triumph, but Stacey Abrams should get a lot of credit. Key thing for our purpose, what brought Georgia to the brink? Organizing did. Organizing explains Georgia going blue in this case. Okay, so it looks like we often ask the notion of social organizing to do some pretty substantive work in our political discourse, but there are those who think there actually isn't a concept of social organizing that can really substantively fill that function. So here are Burns and Clover saying, look, for political actors, organize must in some regard be the right thing to do, insofar as it is a term both commonsensical and capacious in its lack of specificity. It risks being what Frederick Jameson calls a pseudo-concept. The imperative to organize comes down to do that thing that causes you to be more rather than less effective. Now, Burns and Clover may well be right that when some people use the word organize, that's all that they have in mind, or that's the only notion of organizing that could be really attributed to them. Clearly, if they're right, then the notion of organizing can't fill either of the functions that we want it to, right? So if pointing to that absence of organizing is just saying that the derogated strategy is an ineffective one, well then it doesn't amount to offering a reason for thinking that the derogated strategy is ineffective, just a reiteration of your position. And if the deflationary view is right, then to say that a policy change or an uprising or an electoral result was won by organizing is just to say something like X happened because events that disposed X to take place preceded it, which would make it explanatorily vacuous. Our goal is to devise a concept of organizing which is guided by existing usage, but also allows the concept to play a substantive role in strategic deliberation and in explanation. That is, we want to come up with a non-deflationary account of what social organizing is. Okay, so we're going to start now on some initial attempts, initial forays into the business of giving a kind of concept of social organizing that can do what we want it to do. And here's a kind of framing assumption. Organizing is a kind of goal-directed activity. That by itself is clearly not a whole theory. We want to narrow it down. How do we narrow it down? Well, here's a general idea. And because this is a short talk, I'm going to omit a whole bunch of the thought process that might get us to the plausibility of this basic idea. I do think it's kind of intuitive, though, and we can talk about it in Q&A. Here's the idea. Social organizing encompasses some subset of events that have the following form. They operate upon one social object, call that the operands. They yield a social object, the output, and they do this in service of bringing about some event, the goal. And so one way of precisifying this idea is to talk about the kind of relation that's going to exist between the operands and the output. Here's one attempt at that precisification. Organizing is an activity which aims to achieve a goal by building a new, more complex structured group to effect this goal. Okay? Organizing builds a new, more complex structured group. Let's wrap our heads around this proposal. O1 is what we'll call this first run at a theory of organizing. O1 suggests that organizing is special among goal-oriented activities, and I should say that where I talk about organizing here, I always have social organizing in mind, because it adopts a special kind of means to its end. This expression structured groups that appeared in O1, I'm going ahead and plugging in here a fairly specific notion of structured grouphood, and that's basically the one that Catherine Ritchie and Kit Fine have advanced, where structured groups are things like clubs, sports teams, bands. They're different from social kinds, things like women, people with red hair, Black Americans, in a couple of ways. One is that social kinds are built out of members who all have something in common, whereas members of a structured group needn't have anything in common prior to their joining the group. And whereas social kinds needn't as such contain any sort of functional structure, the functional structure is really the essence of what these structured groups are. And we see that if we reflect on the fact that whereas sets are individuated by their elements, structured groups on this account are individuated by their functional structure. So a structured group can survive member change across time and across worlds, so long as it maintains the same functional structure. And a functional structure is a set of functional relations between nodes, where those nodes are fillable by individuals. Okay, so we understand O1 as a proposal, but I think as attractive as O1 is in some ways, we run immediately into a counterexample in the form of what is sometimes called structure-based organizing. Here, Jane McAlevey cites both the labor movement and the civil rights movement as involving a lot of structure-based organizing. And what she means is that these are instances of organizing that operate upon antecedently existing structures. And those structures were, respectively, the workplace and the Black church under Jim Crow. So the idea here is that, for instance, if you go into an established workplace, it's not as though the people who work there don't yet bear any functional relations to one another prior to starting a union organizing project, for instance, right? They bear functional relations to one another in virtue of the kind of labor that they perform for their employer, for instance. One person writes the memos and the other person edits it. One person stocks the shelves, another person takes the thing off the shelf and puts it in a package. Those are functional relations, right? In addition to which coworkers may train each other, bear social relationships to one another, they may cover each other's shifts sometimes. So there is this functional structure and therefore a structured group there antecedent to building a union. Now, where structured groups are individuated based on the functional structure that they realize, then a union, which establishes different functional relations among the workers, does count as a new structured group, okay? So the fact that it's going to have the same members as the antecedent structured group, that's fine. We still get a new group on kind of the Ritchie-style account of what structured groups are. But the thing to note is that it's not that the union is more complex than the antecedent structured group, okay? And complexity was something that O1 posited as necessary for organizing. Okay, so that's not a big deal, right? We can revise O1 to something very like it. Here we have organizing 2, which says organizing is an activity which aims to achieve its goal by building a new structured group to effect this goal. All right, we just dropped the requirement that the new structured group be more complex than whatever the operands of the organizing activity were. But I kind of think we run immediately into a counterexample to this one too. So here's a case to consider, and this is a case of what we might call internal organizing. So Gian discovers that although her organization has several hundred dues current members, only a dozen or so are regularly showing up to meetings, and she sets about contacting inactive members and encouraging them to take over work from currently active members who are burning out. This is something that I think in so-called organizing circles would often be referred to as an organizing task. But here's the thing to observe about it. It looks like what's happening here is that Gian is sort of shuffling which nodes of the group's functional structure are filled by which people. Remember that on the account of structured groups that we're working with, a structured group survives such shuffling, right? Different nodes can be fulfilled by different people at different times. That's fine. If that functional structure stays the same, you got the same group. So it looks like it's not just that internal organizing doesn't create a more complex new group. It doesn't yield a new group at all. Okay. Now, it might be reflected here that the particular kind of theory of structured groups that we've plugged in here is doing some serious work in making these counterexamples. And that maybe there's a version of O1 or O2, which is going to be viable if you just combine it with a different theory of grouphood. And there are lots of those on the market, as we know. Because of time, I definitely can't systematically go through every account of grouphood, but I will just say it's not actually clear to me that there's any account of groups or really any kind of complex social entity such that if you plug it into O1 and O2, you're not going to run into some kind of problem. I won't go into detail here, but I think, for instance, Effingham's sophisticated set account actually makes structured organizing a counterexample not only to O1 but also to O2, and we could talk about why in the Q&A if you like. The natural fix, right, to the kinds of accounts we've given would be to give a theory of groups which has highly sensitive individuation conditions, so even small alterations will amount to having created a new group, right? But there are trade-offs for doing that, right? So when really any kind of modification to a social system is going to count as creating a new group, this does start to pose some risk of overgeneration. And if that overgeneration is too rampant, then you might worry that virtually any action taken in the social domain would count as organizing on that kind of view. And if organizing is everywhere, well, then I don't know that it can play the kind of substantive role that we want it to. I think that there's a way of trivializing the concept and heading back towards something like a kind of deflationary view, which we don't want. So in any case, we're going to, for now, drop this tactic of group creation as the core of a theory of social organizing. Where do we go to from here? Well, can we say this? Organizing is an activity which aims to achieve its root by modifying a social system in such a way that that system will then be able to affect this goal. This starts to get a bit squishy for my taste. And that's because note that the goal events of social organizing are often sort of constitutively social themselves. I don't think that that's always the case. Note that on the kind of accounts of social organizing that we've considered thus far, anyways, this kind of means to achieving the goal event is kind of constitutively social. It involves acting on social systems. But social organizing might take as its goal event something like not having catastrophic climate change occur. And it's not clear to me that that's a constitutively social thing. But in any case, because a lot of social organizing takes as its goal something like electing such and such person or abolishing such and such institution and replacing it with another, those are constitutively social phenomena. And so when I look at something like O3, I start to worry that what it starts to sound like is organizing is an attempt to achieve one sort of social modification by achieving another one first. And then any sort of multi-step means-end reasoning in broadly the social domain is going to count as organizing. We're back to triviality. That's not what we want. Okay. The natural thought here is, well, let's be a little bit more specific about what modification we have in mind here. We've accepted for now that it can't involve the creation of a new kind of entity, but we could still be more specific, surely, than O3. I think that is what this next suggestion amounts to doing, is being specific about what kind of modification is going on. The way to get there, though, is actually reflecting on the last part of Organizing 3, which has more or less actually survived relatively unscrutinized all the way from O1 to O3. This idea that the system that is created or modified will be able to effect with an E, the goal that the organizer initially had in mind. And what that kind of way of thinking suggests is that what the organizer is doing isn't to be thought of so much as picking up a certain tool off the shelf to go about achieving their end. It's not even quite that they're constructing a new tool and then going to work with it. It's more like they're constructing a new tool user that in some way comes to subsume or replace the agent that did the constructing, right? And that way of thinking about this naturally leads us to think, well, okay, maybe what organizing is doing is creating an agent. It's creating the kind of thing that can use tools, that can go on to intentionally meet a certain kind of goal. So here's that view. Organizing is an activity which aims to achieve some goal by way of creating a collective agent capable of intentionally achieving that goal. Now, the notion of a collective or group agent, as well as a bunch of related collective intentionality stuff, there's been a lot of literature on that in the last couple of decades. So it's probably a familiar idea to lots of us. The basic idea behind a collective agent is that a collective agent has what any agent has. Here are list and pedit, listing some of those characteristics. An agent has to have representational and motivational states. They have to have the ability to act on these. And they have to be such that they're kind of apt to be assessed for various kinds of rationality. And list and pedit emphasize that this last criterion in particular seems to require some kind of like extendedness, whereas phenomena like joint intention can happen as a one-off. A collective agent is really an entity that seeks to do multiple things together, maybe over time. Now, under what conditions does an individual count as part of a group agent? Well, for list and pedit, and I'm kind of taking their account of group agency off the shelf for our purposes here, for an individual to be a member of a group agent, it's both necessary and sufficient, actually. They play either an authorizing or an active role. So the idea is a group agent can be constituted by a bunch of individuals, not all of whom have to be actively engaged in the work of furthering the group agent's ends. Some can merely kind of give their consent that others do so in some sense in their name. These are the authorizing agents. And then the active members are those who act in full awareness for the pursuit of the group's end. But what's important is that a person can't just kind of self-elect as to be an active member. It has to be the case that you have the consent, the authorization, the legitimation by authorizing members of the group. That's going to be key in understanding why I think there ends up being a counterexample to O4. And that comes in the form of social movements. So there's, of course, a lot to be said about what precisely social movements are. They're these really interesting entities, right? But a couple observations that will be relevant for our purposes is that social movements are composed of individuals, yet they're not the same as groups, for instance. They're not the same kind of entity we were talking about before. Movements do attract groups and the long tail of individuals that don't belong to any group, but they're not themselves groups. And here's another thing that I think is important to observe about social movements. Constituents of a movement, those participating individuals and groups, may share some overarching goal. You might have an account of movements where that's kind of like a necessary condition of being in a movement together is sharing some goal, although that might itself be controversial. But even when they do agree on some overarching goal, they disagree about many other goals and which tactics will achieve any of them. I think this is very common in social movements, although I don't have the time here to give case studies. And so constituents of a social movement may work together sometimes for initiatives where they share a tactical vision, but they needn't form any permanent cooperative agreement. Some social movements, in fact, will be such that no constituent acknowledges any constituent beyond themselves as having a right to speak or act for them. No constituent can then count as an active member in a group agent, if there were a group agent here, because no one would authorize them to be so. But if any group agent must have some active members, well, then it looks like there could be no group agent here at all, which means that social movements of the kind that I've just described just aren't group agents. And to the extent that you think that social movements like these can nonetheless be the outcome of organizing, well, then these movements are a counterexample to O4. Okay, I've run a little bit over time, but I want to quickly say what I think we've accomplished here and maybe briefly talk about some prospects for moving forward with an account of social organizing. So what we've seen is that political discourse relies on a substantive notion of social organizing. We use it in our strategic deliberation. We use it in our explanation of past events, of past social political events. We've also seen why an adequate theory capable of performing these functions doesn't clearly fall out of theories of groups, of group ontology or group agency. Now, I think the next possibility that would make sense to encounter after the group agency account is one on which, okay, maybe organizing doesn't have to bring into existence full-fledged group agency, but what about joint intention, this phenomenon that can be a little bit more ephemeral, a little bit more one-off than group agency can? I reserve suspicions that there are instances of movements that deserve to be called organized where even joint intention isn't in place. So I don't think this is a slam dunk, but it does deserve consideration. And the last thing that I'll mention here is when we stand back and we think of organized groups and group agents and even joint intentions, and we ask, well, why do people configure themselves these ways? Well, you might think it's because an agent can kind of be more efficient in their exercises of agency to bring about the things that they care about when they're sort of keeping an eye on what other people are doing and acting in ways that are contingent with what others are doing. You might give an account of social organizing which connects organizing directly to some notion of causal efficiency and skip the notions of group agency or grouphood that might have mediated that connection between causal efficiency and organizing. In any case, these are just some ideas, and I look forward to discussing them more.